young man on trial right now. His fate is in the hands of the military judge. This is not a jury trial. I'm Amy Goodman. This is Democracy Now! We're talking about Bradley Manning, the trial that just wrapped in closing arguments Thursday and Friday, now in the hands of Colonel Denise Lind at Fort Meade, which is the headquarters of the National Security Agency in Maryland. Our guests are journalist Alexa O'Brien, who spent every day in the courtroom from the beginning of the trial to the end. She's sitting outside in her car now in order to be able to speak to us. We are also joined by Michael Ratner, attorney for Julian Assange and Wikileaks, president emeritus of the Center for Constitutional Rights. He, too, has been attending the Bradley Manning trial, not every single day. But we also want to talk about the significance of how often WikiLeaks and Julian Assange were raised in this trial. Is this trial a preparation for a next stage? But, Alexa, talk about the list of witnesses and the significance of them, what you found most interesting.
Are you talking about on the trial on the merits that we've just finished?
Yes.
Here we have the government bringing out their original classification authorities, and these are government witnesses who will testify that the information Manning allegedly or admittedly leaked was national security information and that it was closely held. But what was really, really interesting is that fundamentally, as defense has pointed out, these original classification authorities that are oftentimes the commanders of CENTCOM, Central Command, or Pacific Command, or Patrick Kennedy, who's the Undersecretary for Management at the Department of State, they have an invested interest in essentially saying that their classification determinations of the information was actually accurate. So this is an important point because we have to understand Manning is not on trial for actual harm. He's on trial for probable harm. So the government brought out witnesses that essentially testified to those two criminal elements. But they also tried to bring out witnesses that were going to say that Bradley Manning was a bad soldier or that he was, as Mr. Ratner had said, a traitor. But really, except for Showman, who the defense impeached the credibility of her testimony when she said that Manning, said he didn't have any loyalty to the flag when she tapped her shoulder and the flag on her uniform. They've all said that Manning was one of the best analysts, that he was the go-to analyst, that he was a hard worker. Something that was interesting in defense closing arguments is they said that the government can't have it both ways. They can't say that Manning was lazy because he was, working all night trying to exfiltrate information, and that he was also the go-to analyst, using disjointed logic depending on which charge or which aspect they were trying to essentially assert in court. In terms of the defense, we had one of the most really a historic elocution by law professor Yochai Benkler, who was the defense expert on WikiLeaks, who talked to the judge in a very candid manner about the threat to the delicate balance between the national security reporting and the First Amendment if she found Manning guilty of aiding the enemy. One of the important things that we have to remember is aiding the enemy, Article 104, is one of the two violations under the Uniform Code of Military Justice that applies to any person. So it's beyond Manning's duty as a soldier. This is about really every citizen in the United States.
And Alexa, the ability to get information out, I mean, what you started doing in this trial for people to understand how closely held the information was, that you were the one providing the public with transcripts at the beginning. Explain why the court wasn't doing this.
The court, this is a military court-martial, and Judge Colonel Denise Lind believed, it was her contention, and Mr. Ratner and CCR, filed a suit in respect to this. She felt that there was no First Amendment legal precedent for public access to the court documents. So what she would do is read these really long, mile-a-minute recitations of the motions into the court record, and then deprive us of a media operations center so that we had to actually scribble these things down in our notebooks. And we're not talking about just merely the trial of Bradley Manning, as important as that is. We're talking about setting legal precedent for the future of national security reporting and also whistleblowers. And also, really, even beyond that, just simply people using the internet communicating in legally protected speech, First Amendment rights. Because the government is asserting in this case that essentially the enemy uses the internet, and so if you publish intelligence or you aid the enemy with whatever is classified as intelligence, which is in this case is only has to be true and useful to the enemy. That's the definition. It doesn't have anything to do with classified information. That you could be brought up on the charge of aiding the enemy. So it's very important that we should have had access to these public records. And I think it tells you, it leans more towards a long record of Colonel Denise Lynn being deferential to the government, the prosecution, and doing whatever she can to help them manage this trial and the public perception about it.
Michael Ratner, actually, Denise Lynn, the judge, is going to move out of her position after this, isn't she?
Yeah, she's been given, apparently, from a Washington Post report, a appellate judge job, the higher court, which I found pretty extraordinary. I don't know whether I don't think it's necessarily illegal, but it's interesting to me that she's going upstairs during the very trial that's going on and given that promotion. And it reminded me when the Ellsberg judge, the judge in Daniel Ellsberg's case, the federal judge, during Ellsberg's trial on espionage, was offered to be the head of the FBI secretly by the Nixon administration. And, of course, there was a huge stink. I don't see any stink so far in any of the media about the fact that Denise Lynn, the judge, is being offered to a higher position. And then think about the higher position. She's sitting up there on the court when the Bradley Manning conviction is going to be, assuming there's he's a conviction because he's already pleaded to 10 counts, is going to be reviewed. She won't sit on it, but her fellow judges are going to be sitting there, and are they going to want to reverse one of their fellow judges? So basically it stinks, Amy.
On the issue of aiding the enemy, what would you like to add to what Alexa said?
Well, in some way it's the most serious charge because it's life, if not even death. But the government's theory is what really is awful here. It's basically saying you can aid the enemy by putting information up on the internet that's intelligence. It doesn't have to be classified. And because the enemy reads the internet, you can be accused of aiding the enemy. So which is a death penalty. That ends whistleblowing. What person is going to actually start whistleblowing and giving information to the media if they can get the death penalty? But it also puts the journalist or publisher in the middle, indirectly, according to the government, of aiding the enemy. Now, they claim, well, WikiLeaks is different, but they also understand, and the government understands, that WikiLeaks, the New York Times, the Washington Post, anybody in the middle there indirectly could be accused of aiding the enemy. And it's part and parcel, of course, of the war on whistleblowers and publishers that's going on. And the two that are really relevant to aiding the enemy are what happened with James Risen recently. He was the reporter who was trying to say he doesn't have to testify because of reporter's privilege in the case of in the Sterling case having to do with.
Well, explain. James Risen is a well-known New York Times reporter who wrote a book, and this has to do with Iran, and explain what the court's decision was recently.
Right, and the court's decision is he has no First Amendment right not to testify, no reporter's privilege not to testify.
And implicating Sterling in this trial as being the whistleblower.
And the language of the court should be a warning to every single publisher and journalist out there. It says, Risen is the only eyewitness. He's inextricably involved in the crime. Without him, the crime would not have occurred. So this is saying that the journalist who is reporting on a whistleblower is actually inextricably involved with the crime. Think about what message that sends to every publisher in the country about using sources for their stories. It's a terribly serious problem. It's one that makes me very upset that people aren't now seeing that and coming to the defense of WikiLeaks, which is being put into that position.
WikiLeaks. For a moment, let's just talk about that. I was reading that quote of the prosecutor saying that Bradley Manning deliberately and intentionally disclosed compromised information through WikiLeaks to the world, knowing WikiLeaks would release the information in the form they received it, and that's exactly what happened in this case. What about the emphasis on Julian Assange and WikiLeaks in the court-martial of Bradley Manning?
I've sat there stunned every day I've gone to the courtroom. Julian Assange was mentioned 10 times in the morning of the prosecution's opening. WikiLeaks, 20, 30 times. I don't even know. So there's two things going on here. One is they want to use WikiLeaks as a nefarious organization to paint Bradley Manning as somehow having a bad intent by the two coming together. But secondly, they're obviously trying to paint in the public mind, and obviously what they've been doing at the Justice Department is the next stone that will be unturned here or uncovered here is probably the prosecution of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. We think it's very likely there's already an indictment of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, and you could look at this trial as the setup, really, for getting Julian Assange indicted on this indirect aiding the enemy, etc.
Alex O'Brien, before we leave you, right there in the parking lot of the headquarters in the National Security Agency, where you are awaiting the verdict, explain what the schedule is. What will happen now with the judge, and why this is even a judge trial, not a jury trial?
Manning opted to be tried by the military judge alone. He had the option of a panel of officers and enlisted personnel. If you look at the pretrial record, typically, also first, if you look at just the history jury trials tend to be more partial to the accused. But here we have an accused who is gay in the military, and there is evidence of a struggle with gender identity while he's in Iraq. The defense was concerned that Bradley Manning couldn't get a fair trial with a panel of officers and enlisted personnel, firstly. And secondly, I think that the defense strategy has really been to have the same judge that they could educate over the course of 18 months about very important ideas like access as it relates to exceeding authorized access under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Also, while the statement that Bradley Manning made in February isn't admissible at trial, where he pled to 10 lesser included offenses, she's aware that he made this statement. A jury would not have been aware of that. So there are very important strategic aspects to choosing Judge Lynn alone.
On that one issue, Alexa's right. Those are the reasons. But also the jury in a military case is appointed by the convening authority, who is the general in charge of the proceedings. And it's not taken randomly by choice from a pool.
Alexa O'Brien, the best place where people can go to get your reports, the transcripts, AlexaO'Brien.com?
Yes.
I want to thank you very much for being with us. We'll be in touch with you. We are awaiting the verdict in the judge trial of the court-martial of Bradley Manning. Alexa O'Brien, independent journalist in the courtroom, daily covering the Manning trial, did not miss a day. Michael Ratner, lawyer for Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, president emeritus of the Center for Constitutional Rights. Michael, I'd like to ask you to stay with us after break, because we want to turn now to developments around the case of Edward Snowden. Stay with us.